Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a massive, really fascinating constitutional paradox, right at the heart of India's civil services. We're going to look at how a system that boasts immense diversity at the entry level somehow, quietly, filters it all out before anyone reaches the top. We're looking at a deeply entrenched system here, one that actually originated as a steel frame of the British Raj, literally a colonial administration built to rely on specific, elite castes to maintain control. So the big question we have to ask ourselves today is, how does a system that looks incredibly diverse at the front door end up looking exactly like its historical predecessors in the rooms where the most crucial decisions are actually made? Take a second to think about this powerful quote from our source material. Merit is what you call the result after social advantage has already done its work. I mean, wow, that perfectly hits the nail on the head for what we're investigating today. Sure, the formal exams might have opened up to everyone, but the actual architecture of power, whether in the civil services, the judiciary, or politics, well, it remains largely unchanged from its British-era, pre-reservation origins. To unpack all of this, we're going to follow an officer's timeline. We'll look at 1. The entry gate paradox. 2. The 30-year trap. 3. The empanelment wall. 4. Bypasses and invisible attrition. 5. The judicial and political apex. And finally, number 6, the transparency demand. Let's get right into it. Section 1, the entry gate paradox, how diversity at the bottom disappears at the top. So we've got to start by acknowledging a very real, genuine achievement here. The front gates of the Indian administrative system have swung wide open to welcome a historically diverse generation. Between 2018 and 2022, reserved and backward categories together made up roughly 54% of combined IAS and IPS appointments. That's a massive shift. But as our source points out, entry is absolutely not the same thing as power. And here is where we hit a statistical cliff. While those reserved categories make up 54% of recent entry-level appointments, a 2019 RTI revealed they represent just 5% at the secretary level. Just 5%. That is a staggering drop-off. Imagine 54 people walking through the front door of a building, but only 5 of them actually making it to the boardroom. The commanding heights of the civil service, those top central levels, simply do not reflect the diversity we are seeing at the entry level today. Now, this disparity didn't just happen in a vacuum, right? It is a direct legacy of the colonial system. To put it into perspective, as late as 1985, roughly 37% of IAS officers self-identified as Brahmin. That is a group representing just about 5% of the overall population. So those crucial, critical positions at the top central level today, they are still heavily echoing this historical dominance. It's a legacy stretching all the way back to the pre-reservation era. Moving on to Section 2, the 30-year trap, the seniority latency delay. This brings us to a structural phenomenon that's honestly one of the most consequential yet least talked about realities of the civil service timeline. Think about the brutal math of a seniority-based system. Let's say an officer entered under the 1993 OBC reservation, which was the very first year it operated centrally. That officer wouldn't even reach joint secretary eligibility until around 2018, and they won't reach secretary eligibility until the early 2030s. That's like waiting half your lifetime just to get your foot in the boardroom door. What this means in practice is that right now, the top tiers are entirely dominated by pre-reservation cohorts. Essentially, the past is actively adjudicating the present. Section 3. The empanelment wall. The filters that decide who rises. So, the really crucial question is, what actually happens in those 3 decades between entry and the summit? Well, once officers start aiming for joint secretary positions and above, they hit a massive wall, where the constitutional reservation framework simply no longer operates. How does this wall actually work? Mostly through highly discretionary filters. Documented allegations show that reserved category officers routinely report getting downgraded evaluations. And in this specific system, the subjective difference between an outstanding rating and just a good rating is literally enough to permanently stall a career. Officers also report being passed over for the high-profile metropolitan postings that are totally required for central empanelment, or suddenly finding themselves facing retaliatory vigilance inquiries. It creates this deeply subjective gauntlet that historically works against those from non-dominant backgrounds. Section 4, bypasses and invisible attrition, operating outside the reservation framework. You see, it's not just about who gets promoted, it's also about how entirely new doors are opened up at the very top. Take the lateral entry scheme, for example. Parliamentary replies actually confirm that these senior contract appointments operate completely without category records or demographic audits. Because they're technically considered single post appointments, they act as a neat little bypass lane around the constitutional requirement for representation. So the entry gate opens with quotas, but this bypass lane to the top senior positions, it leaves absolutely no constitutional footprint. Then we have this issue of invisible attrition. Historically, research shows that up to 30% of reserved backlog vacancies have been de-reserved simply because of administrative delays. Basically, if the recruitment machinery fails to fill a reserved seat, it gets essentially laundered back into the open general category. This quietly drains the minority talent pool and permanently erases those future seniority slots. It's wild when you think about it. Section 5. The judicial and political apex, replicating privilege in other branches. Now, this whole funnel effect we've been talking about, it isn't strictly isolated to the civil services. We actually see this exact same structural replication happening across other branches of the state. Just look at the judiciary. Independent analyses suggest that upper castes constitute over 60% of the Supreme Court bench. This is heavily driven by a self-replicating collegium system. Judges ascend to the Supreme Court after decades in a profession where access to premier networks is frankly very unevenly distributed. A collegium selecting peers based on perceived professional excellence tends to reward traits that align with historical privilege, so it effortlessly reproduces its own composition. And even in the political sphere, you might see a diverse cabinet on paper, but look closely at the commanding heights, the crucial portfolios, like finance, which controls the entire nation's budget, and home, which controls internal security. These consistently remain concentrated among dominant castes. These are the decisions that directly impact your everyday life. At the state level, independent tracking suggests up to 90% of chief secretary positions are held by the general category. So as we can see, raw headcount isn't true power, the commanding heights are. Bringing us to Section 6, the transparency demand, solving the data gap. So how does our source suggest we address a constitutional paradox where the state meticulously counts categories at the entry level, but totally obscures actual caste power at the summit? The most consequential reform being demanded here isn't actually a new quota or some percentage target. It's pure sunlight, transparency. The demand is to force the government to publish subcaste data for active cadres, to release the distribution of those appraisal grades we talked about, and to clearly show the success rates of empanelment. By publishing this data, the public can finally actually audit the system to see if the constitutional promise of adequate representation is truly being fulfilled. Because let's be honest, correcting inequality at the entry gate is ultimately meaningless if the post-selection architecture just quietly restores that exact same inequality in the boardroom where the true power is exercised. If the structure above the gate relies on discretionary filters, old historical networks, and bypass schemes, well, the summit is always going to look fundamentally different from the entrance. Which leaves us with this final, vital question to reflect on. The entry gate is undeniably open, but until transparency allows us to audit the entire staircase, who actually holds the commanding heights? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking the hard questions, and always look at the structures hiding right behind the data.